Hands-on Harpoons is an experimental archaeology research project looking into the manufacture of bone tools in prehistory, so how we go from natural bone like this to tools that can be used like these three harpoons. This video is designed to give both members of the public who have a general interest in archaeology and prehistory an idea into how different things might be made, as well as researchers who might be exposed to bone tools within their own work and want to know a bit more about the process and the kind of methods that are used. I hope this video is useful.
The first part of the harpoon making process is to obtain a piece of bone from the natural form. In this case I'm using a rib which needs to be split. To do this, the best way is to hollow out the trabecular bone at one end to make a notch which you can then place either a wedge-shaped flake or an uti ekia inside, and then you use a hammerstone to hammer the wedge or flake into this notch, and that will split the rib. And ultimately it leaves you with a segment of bone which can then be modified to create a harpoon. Next, I want to cut the segment of bone into an approximate size and shape of the piece we want to manufacture the harpoon. The easiest way to do this is to use a blade or a point to score a line so that when you split that piece of bone, it splits predictably. Now we want to split the bone into the size that we need. So I'm going to use a hammerstone with a wedge-shaped flake so that one edge is sharp and pointed to hammer the flake along the scored line. This is where the bone's weakest, and if it works properly it should split the bone down the line that we've dictated. Now that we have a piece of bone in the approximate size and shape that we want, we can further refine it using a stone tool and a hammerstone again. This can save time with the next step, which is grinding the bone into a blank shape, although it's not necessary, so you could skip straight to the next step. By doing this, it saves grinding time and you get a closer shape to what you ultimately want, and you're also able to easily and quickly remove weaker parts of the bone that may snap off or cause problems later on in the process. The next step is then to create what we call a blank, so it's a spatula-shaped piece of bone that resembles ultimately the final shape of your harpoon. This process can take a long time, so if you completed the previous step, it will save you some time. For this I use a grindstone, which in this case is an ochre-coloured sandstone. It's easier if you wet it, otherwise the bone shears off the hard surface of the stone rather than being ground down. Through this process it allows you to both shape the piece of bone, so rounding the edges, the squared edges, which takes one of the longest times, also straightening the piece of bone so that it's uniform. Now that we have a finished blank for the harpoon, The next step is to start cutting the barbs. So before this, you can mark out where you want the barbs of the harpoon to go. This is an optional step, and I wouldn't normally do it because it takes time and isn't really necessary. To do this, I would normally use a point with a notch in it. The point's good for scoring and marking along the edges where you would like the barbs to be cut, and then the notch is good for cutting around the edge of the tool. The other reason I wouldn't normally do this is because bone can be quite unpredictable and it doesn't necessarily follow the pattern that you would like. Once you've marked out the barbs, you're now ready to cut the barbs. This is probably the part in the process that takes the longest, and it normally takes several hours. It's also quite hard work, and you need a relative amount of strength in your fingers to do this. It's also the part of the process that requires the most variety in tools. So you'll see in this video that I'll use 3 tools here. So one is a blade for cutting or sawing, a point, normally with a notch in as well, and a larger tool that has a very thin bladed edge, but also that's very thick in section, so it has a robusticity. Probably the most difficult part of the process as well as the longest, because cutting sharp barbs without snapping the end off a barb is quite difficult. Once you've finished cutting the barbs, you're then ready to cut what we call the talon, so the bottom part of the harpoon which would attach to a projectile that would allow it to be thrown. There are many different types of talon. In this one I'm using a notch talon, so what I do for this is to saw down into the bone and then to use a shaving motion and 2 different kinds of tools to chisel away the bone up to that sawn part of the line, which then gives me an indentation. Once you've cut the talon, you then need to cut or can cut further notches which allow a string or rope to be attached securely to the talon. This is probably the easiest part of the process, and I would just use a blade to literally saw down into the bone and create 3 or 4 notches which allow you to wrap a string or twine around. The final part in the process is sharpening the point. This is always done last, otherwise you risk snapping off the point or stabbing yourself with it. And it can either be done by shaving using a stone tool or by a process of grinding. You now have a finished bone harpoon. The stone tools used in this process and the debitage or remaining bone can now be used for further analyses. Thank you for watching.